Austin, Texas, December 24th. My phone buzzes with a threat disguised as a mother's invitation. I am Kate Morton, and for 9 years I have been a ghost to my own family. My father didn't just disown me, he promised to erase me from existence because I wouldn't sacrifice my future for his ego. He thought he buried me under silence and shame. But tonight, I am driving back to the house where I died, not as the daughter he threw away, but as the invisible owner of the debt that is about to swallow him whole. He thinks he is inviting a victim to dinner. He doesn't know he is opening the door to his own reckoning. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The notification lit up my phone screen in the quiet of my Austin apartment, a single bubble of text that managed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. It was from my mother. Christmas Eve dinner, family only, important discussion. Most people would read those words and think of pot roast eggnog and perhaps a family announcement about a vacation or a new engagement. But I felt my stomach drop through the floorboards. In the Morton house, important discussion was never a conversation. It was code. It was a diplomatic wrapper for an ambush, a phrase my parents used right before they cornered you emotionally to extract exactly what they wanted. I stared at the glowing pixels, my thumb hovering over the delete button, my heart hammering a rhythm I hadn't felt in nearly a decade. The last time I had sat down for an important discussion with them, I hadn't just lost an argument. My parents had tried to erase me from existence. To understand why a text message could make a 29-year-old woman's hands shake, you have to understand the town I grew up in and the shadow my father cast over it. 9 years ago, in a Midwestern town where the cornfields met the suburbs, Greg Morton wasn't just a business owner. He was a local institution. He owned Morton Lumber and Supply, a chain of 3 massive stores that supplied every contractor in the county. He was a city councilman, the kind of man who wore a suit to the grocery store and spoke in sound bites about hard work, legacy, and family values. To the public, he was the pillar of the community, the man who built the town. Inside our house, he was a king who demanded absolute loyalty. My mother Linda was his anxious press secretary, terrified of a hair out of place or a rumor at the country club. My younger brother Tyler was the crown prince, 17 years old and already arrogant, groomed to inherit the kingdom. And then there was me, the daughter who asked too many questions. It happened on a Sunday in late August, just weeks before I was supposed to leave for my senior year of college. The table was set with the good china, which should have been my first warning. The air in the dining room was stifling, smelling of heavy gravy and unsaid words. My grandmother, Ruth, my father's mother, sat at the end of the table, unusually quiet, her eyes darting between my father and me. Tyler was smirking, cutting his steak with a deliberate, annoying screech of metal on porcelain. My father wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, cleared his throat, and launched into the speech. I knew the cadence well. It started with how much he and Mom had sacrificed, how they had worked 18-hour days so we could have opportunities they never had. "Your mother and I have paved the road for you, Kate," he said, his voice booming with that practiced councilman resonance. "We've made sure your future is secure." He smiled then, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's why I've taken the liberty of declining that internship you applied for in Chicago. You won't be needing it." I froze my fork halfway to my mouth. "You did what?" "I signed you on as the new floor manager at the East Side store," he continued, ignoring my shock. "Effective Monday. It's time you learned the family business. Eventually, you'll help Tyler run things." The silence that followed was deafening. He hadn't asked me. He had canceled the internship that was my ticket out of this suffocating town and shackled me to a lumber yard I hated. I put my fork down. My hands were trembling not from fear, but from a sudden white-hot clarity. I told him no. I told him I was moving to Austin to work for a fintech startup, that I was going to build an app to help people escape the kind of predatory loans Morton Lumber used to trap struggling families. I told him I wouldn't live in a town where he could pull strings to control my life. The argument escalated instantly. My father didn't know how to handle defiance. He only knew how to crush it. He stood up, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple, and slammed his hand on the table. The silverware jumped. "You are selfish and ungrateful," he shouted. "You are spitting on the Morton name." Tyler laughed, leaning back in his chair. "Let her go, Dad. She'll come crawling back when rent is due. She can't survive without your credit card." My mother was weeping silently, pleading with me to stop embarrassing the family, to just say thank you. But I didn't back down. I stood up to leave, and that was when my father delivered the wound that would define the next decade of my life. He pointed a shaking finger at my face, his eyes cold and dead. "If you walk out that door, you don't have a father," he spat. "From this moment on, Kate Morton is dead to this family. I will erase you from our lives. Do you hear me? I will erase you." He ordered everyone at the table to treat me as if I had never been born. No calls, no financial help, no mention of my name. It was surreal hearing my own father promise to delete me like a mistake on a balance sheet. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to defend me, but she just looked down at her plate. Tyler snickered, muttering, "Good luck paying off those student loans." Only Grandma Ruth moved. As I grabbed my duffel bag by the front door, shaking with adrenaline and grief, she shuffled up behind me. She pressed a folded piece of paper and a wad of cash into my hand. "Go," she whispered fiercely. "Don't let them threaten your future, Katie. Real family doesn't erase you because you choose your own life." I stepped out into the humid Midwestern night, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind me, with a finality that felt like a gunshot. I had less than $200, a crumpled note from my grandmother, and my father's curse ringing in my ears. I thought being disowned was the worst thing my parents could do to me. I thought the nightmare was over because I had escaped. I was wrong. It was only the beginning. I arrived in Austin with the transmission of my beat-up sedan slipping and less than $200 in my pocket. Freedom, I quickly learned, tasted a lot like instant noodles and anxiety. My new life began in a cramped room I found on Craigslist, shared with 3 strangers who treated dishwashing like a competitive sport they refused to play. My bedroom had a broken window taped over with cardboard, and the futon mattress I slept on smelled faintly of stale beer and someone else's sweat. But every night when I locked that hollow core door, I took a deep breath and reminded myself this poverty was mine. It didn't belong to Greg Morton. For the first 2 years, I lived in survival mode. I worked the breakfast shift at a diner from 5 to 1, spent my afternoons teaching myself coding on a refurbished laptop I'd bought at a pawn shop, and drove for a rideshare app until 2 in the morning. On weekends, I picked up shifts at a call center, getting yelled at by strangers about their cable bills. I was exhausted, thinning out, and constantly on the edge of financial ruin, but I was building something. I managed to talk my way into a junior position at a tiny fintech startup that operated out of a converted garage. Their mission was simple: build tools to help people escape payday loans and abusive debt cycles. It wasn't just a job, it was personal. I had grown up watching my father's company extend credit to struggling families for renovations, only to tighten the noose with exorbitant interest rates and threaten foreclosure the moment a payment was late. I poured my rage into the work, staying late to master UX design and data regulations, determined to be the weapon that broke systems like his. But living erased carried a heavy emotional tax. In the quiet moments between shifts, usually around 300 a.m., when the adrenaline wore off, I would torture myself by scrolling through my hometown's community Facebook page. I saw photos of the annual charity gala, the 4th of July parade, the ribbon cuttings. My parents and Tyler were always there, smiling that polished porcelain smile. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In a reposted family picture from a cousin's wedding, one taken before I left, I wasn't just absent, I had been digitally cropped out. My shoulder was missing from the edge of the frame. My father hadn't just stopped talking to me. He was rewriting history to make it look like I had never existed at all. One night, in a moment of weakness, I dialed my mother's number. It rang 4 times, then it went to voicemail. When I tried again a minute later, the call went straight to a busy signal. She had blocked me. It felt like my entire childhood had been sacrificed on the altar of my father's ego. I found solace in the only people who treated me like a human being, my coworkers. Mia Lopez, a brilliant product manager and single mom, took me under her wing, becoming the older sister I never had. She taught me how to negotiate a salary and how to stand my ground in meetings dominated by men. Then there was Eli Turner, a mechanical engineer who volunteered at the community center where we sometimes tested our app. He was grounded and kind, offering me rides when my car died and bringing me coffee without expecting anything in return. Through them, I learned what respect felt like. It wasn't transactional, it wasn't conditional. By my third year, our prototype app was gaining traction in low-income neighborhoods. A local news station picked up the story featuring me as the small-town girl fighting predatory debt. I was proud, foolishly thinking my distance protected me. But the internet is a small place. My father saw the story. Furious that I was publicly criticizing the exact kind of credit practices Morton Lumber utilized, he went on the offensive. I didn't know it at the time, but he began calling his contacts bankers, suppliers, friends of friends in the business world, painting me as unstable, mentally unwell, and ungrateful. Suddenly, job offers that had seemed like sure things vanished after the final interview. An investor who had been keen on my side project ghosted me completely. I felt the invisible walls closing and the subtle pressure of his influence reaching across state lines to choke me. The stress finally caught up with me on a Tuesday afternoon. I stood up from my desk and the world tilted sideways. I woke up in the ER with an IV in my arm and a doctor telling me I had collapsed from exhaustion and malnutrition. The bill was staggering. For a fleeting second, I considered calling home. Then I remembered the blocked number. I remembered the cropped photo. I was truly dead to them. I decided right there, staring at the fluorescent hospital lights, that if I ever gained power, I would never use it to threaten someone's security the way my father did. I called Grandma Ruth a week later to tell her I was okay. I won't let what they did erase me. I told her, my voice raspy but steady. Someday I'll make them see what they threw away. Ruth didn't offer empty comfort. Her voice was low, conspiratorial. You just focus on staying alive, Katie. Your father, he's moving fast. He's expanding Morton Lumber, aggressively taking out risky loans to open 3 more stores in the next county. He thinks he can't lose, but every king forgets what happens when the numbers stop adding up. The turning point didn't come with a bang, but with a whisper over a crackling phone line. It was late, the kind of stillness that usually signals bad news when Grandma Ruth called me. Her voice, usually so steady and full of quiet rebellion, was shaking. She told me that Greg had finally done it. He had bet the farm. Driven by a desperate need to compete with the big box stores and online giants that were slowly suffocating his business, my father had leveraged everything to expand into a regional chain. He had put up the stores, the trucks, and even Ruth's small bungalow as collateral. He's chasing ghosts, Katie. She whispered, the fear palpable in her voice. Interest rates are climbing, foot traffic is down, and he's drowning. But you know your father. He would sacrifice every single one of us before he would admit he was wrong. That conversation lit a fire in me that survival alone never could. A few months later, the startup I worked for was acquired by a major bank. My equity payout wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to stop counting pennies at the grocery store. Most people would have taken a vacation or put a down payment on a condo. Instead, I doubled down. I founded my own company, Clearline. I didn't just want to track debt, I wanted to fix it. We built a platform that helped small businesses restructure their liabilities, fairly preventing the kind of predatory contracts that killed mom-and-pop shops and trapping employees in uncertainty. I was driven by a specific cold anger, the memory of Morton Lumber trapping its customers and its own family. The climb to real power was a grind. I walked into boardrooms where investors looked at me, a young woman in her 20s, and asked where the real CEO was. I faced sexism that was thinly veiled as concern for my work-life balance. But I kept going. I used my story in pitches, stripping away the names, but keeping the pain. I told them about growing up in a family business that taught me exactly how debt could be weaponized to control people. It worked. Clearline landed a breakthrough partnership with a mid-tier bank looking to clean up its image. Revenue exploded. I moved the team into a bright, airy office downtown. Eli came on as our lead architect, and Mia became my head of operations. They were the ones who celebrated with me, who held me up when I was tired. They were my real family. Then came the discovery. Because of our partnership with the bank, I had access to their distressed commercial portfolio loans that were failing businesses that were on the brink. One Tuesday, while running a routine data audit, a file name caught my eye: Morton Regional Holdings LLC. My heart stopped. I clicked the file, my fingers hovering over the trackpad. I was looking at my father's empire from the inside out, and it was rotting. The screen was a sea of red ink, overdue payments, ballooning variable interest rates, violation notices. My father, the man who had sworn he would erase me, was about to be erased by the very numbers he worshipped. I called Jordan Price, Clearline's razor-sharp legal counsel, into my office. We sat for hours as he laid out a path that terrified and thrilled me. We could create a shell entity, an anonymous LLC, and quietly acquire the non-performing loans tied to Morton Lumber through secondary markets. I could become the note holder. I could own his debt. I hesitated, looking at the skyline. Was this justice? Or was I just becoming him? I called Ruth one last time. "I'm too old to move, Katie," she said softly. "But I'm not afraid of losing a house. I'm afraid of you losing yourself. If you do this, do it clean. Don't do it for cruelty. Do it to stop him." The final piece fell into place when Forbes ran a next-gen finance feature profiling me as the founder rewriting the rules of small-town debt. The article was glowing, praising Clearline for saving local economies. It explicitly mentioned that I had grown up in the Midwest, learning hard lessons about financial control. The article dropped at 9:00 a.m. At 11:30 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I hadn't seen in 9 years. Christmas Eve dinner. Family only. Important discussion. We're so proud of you, sweetie. Mom. I stared at the screen, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. They had seen the article. The banks must have been calling them non-stop, tightening the screws. They were desperate, and suddenly the daughter they had erased was a potential lifeline. They didn't know about the debt purchase. They just knew I had money. I looked out at the Austin sun, my thumb hovering over the reply button. I typed 2 words: "I'll be there." Then I turned back to my laptop where the final transfer document sat waiting. I clicked execute. The transfer was complete. I was now the sole owner of Morton Lumber's debt, the ghost in their paperwork, and I was coming home for Christmas. I flew back to the Midwest on a flight that felt less like a homecoming and more like a deployment. I rented a sedan at the airport, clean, reliable, and completely nondescript. I didn't need to roll up in a luxury car to prove I had made it. My power wasn't parked in the driveway, it was sitting in the leather satchel on the passenger seat. When I pulled up to the Morton house, I had to blink against the glare. The place had grown since I left, bloated with additions and ringed by manicured hedges wrapped in thousands of perfect white lights. It looked like a fortress of aggressive holiday cheer. I stepped out into the crisp winter air, the smell of wood smoke and pine hitting me instantly, accompanied by the faint, tinny sound of Christmas carols piping from hidden outdoor speakers. It was a perfect stage set, designed to convince the neighbors that everything inside was holy and bright. My mother opened the door before I could even knock. "Katie!" she shrieked, her voice pitched an octave too high. Her mascara was flawless, her dress a velvet green that cost more than my first car. She threw her arms around me, squeezing tight as if the last 9 years of silence hadn't happened, as if she hadn't blocked my number while I was in the hospital. Behind her stood Greg. My father looked older, his hair thinner, but he still filled the doorway with that imposing physical presence. He wore his proud father's smile, the same one he used in campaign photos when shaking hands with constituents he secretly despised. "Welcome home, kiddo," he boomed, ushering me in. Tyler was there too, leaning against the banister in branded Morton lumber work gear, looking worn out, but still wearing that permanent sneer of entitlement. Only Grandma Ruth felt real. She appeared from the kitchen looking frail, but glowing, and when she squeezed my hand, I felt the only honest pulse in the house. The dinner was a masterclass in performance art. We sat at the long mahogany table, set with the wedding china, eating catered roast beef, while a string quartet playlist looped in the background. They circled me with small talk, asking vaguely about Clearline without actually listening to the answers. Greg kept repeating, "We're just so proud," like it was a line he was trying to memorize. But the air was thin, pressurized. Finally, after the dessert plates were cleared, Greg set his fork down with a deliberate clink. The room shifted instantly. The warmth evaporated. "Now, Kate," he began, clasping his hands, "we need to discuss the future. As you know, business has its cycles. Morton Lumber is currently, temporarily overextended." He took a sip of wine. "The bank is being unreasonable. But worse, some predatory firm has bought our loans on the secondary market. They're threatening foreclosure on the stores, on this house." He looked at me then, not as a daughter, but as a liquidity event. "This is still your birthright, Katie. Your mother and I sacrificed everything to build this. All we need is $3 million to refinance. It's less than a rounding error to you now." I sat perfectly still. "$3 million, I repeated. Linda's eyes welled up with practiced tears. "This could bring the family back together, honey. It's a fresh start." Tyler scoffed, picking at his teeth. "Come on, Kate. You built an app. You can surely spare a little charity for the people who made you." Greg leaned in, his voice dropping to that dangerous register I remembered from my teenage years. He was pulling out his old weapon, shame. "You can't seriously be the kind of person who lets her own family be destroyed," he said, smoothing the tablecloth. "After everything we did for you. After we sacrificed our good name when you walked out on us." I felt a chill run down my spine, hearing him twist the word sacrificed. He wasn't done. He looked me dead in the eye and delivered the second wound, trying to re-erase me. "You can fix this, Kate, or you can prove what I said that night was right, that you never were a real Morton." Silence stretched across the table, tight as a wire. Under the tablecloth, I felt Ruth's hand close over mine. I took a steadying breath. "This firm," I asked calmly, "the one that's going to erase you, do you know who owns it?" Greg scoffed, dismissive. "Some faceless hedge fund, Northline Acquisitions LLC, a shell company, cowards." "Northline," I said, reaching into my bag. I pulled out a stack of manila folders and a slim laptop. "Funny you should mention them." I nodded toward the hallway. Jordan Price." My attorney stepped into the dining room. I had let him in when I went to the bathroom earlier, and he had been waiting in the foyer. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, holding a briefcase. He placed the loan assignment documents, the mortgage transfers, and the personal guarantees Greg had signed right onto the table, covering the holiday centerpiece. "Mr. and Mrs. Morton," Jordan said, his voice clinical and cold. "My name is Jordan Price. I represent Northline Acquisitions LLC, and I am here to inform you that Northline is a wholly owned subsidiary of Kate Morton." The reaction was visceral. Linda's wineglass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the hardwood, splashing red across the floor. Tyler swore loudly, pushing his chair back. Greg turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. "You," he sputtered, standing up. "You set us up. You betrayed your own flesh and blood. You're threatening the family that gave you everything." Years ago, that accusation would have broken me. I would have cried. I would have begged for forgiveness. But now it clarified everything. I watched him scream, and I felt nothing but a cold, heavy resolve. Jordan didn't blink. He simply handed Greg a formal notice of default. "Foreclosure proceedings can begin within 72 hours, Mr. Morton." The room descended into chaos, shouting, sobbing accusations flying like shrapnel. I remained seated eerily calm, watching the power shift in the room like the turning of a tide. I reached into my bag one last time. "You're right about one thing, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through his shouting. "I am here to erase something tonight." I placed one last thick envelope on the table. "But it's not what you think." The envelope sat on the table between us, a stark white rectangle against the dark mahogany. My father looked at it as if it were a bomb, his chest heaving with exertion. I didn't wait for him to ask what was inside. I reached over and slid the contents out myself, a cashier's check for $400,000 drawn from my personal account, and a thick legal agreement. "This is the deal," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. "I am not here to destroy you, Dad. I'm not going to throw you out on the street the way you would have done to your customers. That check is enough to buy a condo in Florida cash. It's a clean slate, a fresh start." I tapped the legal document. "But in exchange, you sign over full ownership and control of Morton Lumber and all related trusts to Northline immediately. You resign from the board, you relinquish any claim to Grandma Ruth's house, and you leave town." Greg stared at the check, his face twisting in disgust. "You think you can buy me off with my own company?" "It's not your company anymore," Jordan interjected smoothly. "Technically, it belongs to the bank, and now the bank belongs to Kate. I am doing this." I continued, meeting my father's gaze. "Because I will not let you use the Morton name or my grandmother's home to threaten another employee or trap another family in debt ever again. You use this business to bully this town. That ends tonight." Greg slammed his fist on the table. "I would rather lose everything than bow to a traitor. I'll burn it to the ground before I sign it over to you." "We already lost everything, Greg," Linda whispered. Her voice was barely audible. She was staring at the numbers on the foreclosure notice Jordan had left on the table. The fight had drained out of her, replaced by the cold, hard reality of survival. "There is no other offer. If we don't sign, we have nothing." Tyler looked between them, panic rising in his eyes. His entire identity was wrapped up in being the heir to the lumberyard. "Mom, you can't be serious. We can fight this." But it was Grandma Ruth who moved first. She reached across the table, picked up the pen Jordan had provided, and pulled the document toward her. "I'm not afraid of losing a house," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But I won't let you sacrifice Kate again to save your pride, Greg." She signed her name on the witness line, the scratching of the pen the only sound in the room. That broke the dam. Linda, sobbing openly now, took the pen. She mumbled apologies that were 9 years too late, words that dissolved into the air before they reached me. She signed. Then Tyler, swearing under his breath and glaring at me with pure venom, scratched his signature, blaming me for ruining his life, even as I saved him from bankruptcy. Finally, the pen was pushed to Greg. He held it for a long time, his knuckles white. He looked at me with a hatred so deep, it felt like a physical blow, a look that said he would never forgive me for winning. Then he carved his name into the paper, pressing so hard, the tip nearly tore the page. It was a surreal mix of sorrow and triumph, watching the man who promised to erase me sign away the empire he had sacrificed his daughter to build. In the weeks that followed, the fallout rippled through the community, but not in the way my father had predicted. The town learned that Morton Lumber had new ownership, but the mass firings everyone feared never happened. Instead, I restructured everything. We rebranded as Clear Line Home and Supply. I raised wages, implemented profit sharing for the staff who had been there for decades, and immediately halted all predatory credit practices. We partnered with my fintech company to help customers build their credit rather than destroying it. Ruth moved into a cozy, sun-filled bungalow I bought quietly, in her name, a place that was hers, free and clear. Greg and Linda sold the big house and left town within the month. Rumors swirled that they had retired early to the coast, fleeing the shame of their collapse. Tyler stayed in the area, drifting between low-level sales jobs. Occasionally, I would get a drunk text from him at 2:00 a.m., blaming me for his failures. I never responded. 1 year later on Christmas Eve, I sat in Ruth's new living room. The air smelled of cinnamon and real pine. There was no string quartet, no catered roast beef, and no tension. It was just me, Ruth, Eli, and Mia eating homemade tamales and laughing. We decorated a small tree with simple ornaments, including one shaped like a tiny silver house key, a symbol of Ruth's freedom. Toward the end of the night, Ruth handed me a small wrapped square. I opened the frame to see a piece of paper that had been smoothed out and preserved behind glass. It was the crumpled note she had slipped into my hand the night I left, the ink slightly faded but still legible. "Call me any time. Love, Grandma." I looked up at her, my eyes stinging. My father had tried to erase me with a sentence. He had tried to threaten my future to keep control. But in the end, he had erased only his own claim to my life. I raised a mug of hot cocoa to the room, to Eli, to Mia, to Ruth. "To the family you choose," I said softly, "and the future no one gets to threaten again." For the first time, I wasn't the daughter my father erased. I was the woman who wrote her own name, and this time it was never coming off the page. And so Kate Morton finally closed the chapter on her family's cruel attempt to erase her, building a new legacy on her own terms. What did you think of her final move? Let us know in the comments below, as we truly read every single thought and opinion you share. If you enjoyed this dark tale of betrayal and payoff, please subscribe. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.